It's wonderful to be here again with you all in this third session of For the Beauty of the Earth. Just a friendly reminder that we are recording this session to be used in future times when people want to learn from these speakers. So if you have any issues with yourself being visible in a recording, please just send me an email and we'll make sure that we can work with you on that. My name is Nicole Litwiller, for those of you who are joining us for the first time this evening. My pronouns are she, her. Really quickly on pronouns, we often make assumptions about a person's gender, and often those assumptions are incorrect. So using people's correct pronouns is a way of showing respect. So if you'd like, you are welcome to change your name like I have in my name here by hovering over your video box, clicking the three little blue dots, and adding your pronouns to the end of your name by clicking rename there, and you can do that. So my role with the Center for Sustainable Climate Solutions is Climate and Racial Justice Program Coordinator. And I was made aware this week that I haven't actually said much about CSCS in this series so far. So I just wanted to give a quick plug for the organization that is leading these events. So I'm just going to read the mission of CSCS to you all, so you get a bit of a sense of what this organization is all about. So the Center for Sustainable Climate Solutions advances thinking and action in Anabaptist and other faith communities to mitigate climate change. Our work in research, innovation, education, and collaboration catalyzes faith-informed, justice-focused activity that promotes sustainable living, environmental justice, and care for creation. So if anybody wants to follow along a little bit more with what CSCS is up to, I am just going to put the link to the website in the chat here this evening, and you can open that up and explore it on your own time if you want to see a little bit more about what we do beyond this webinar series that we've been up to in this spring season. So a couple of just quick Zoom reminders. Please keep yourself muted while there is a speaker sharing, just to eliminate any disruptions that we might have. The mute button is in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen. For viewing, there are a couple of options there as well. Up at the top right corner, there's a little view button that you can click, and you can either view gallery view, which allows you to see a bunch of people's faces if you'd like to view it that way, or you can view it in speaker view, which will just focus on the person who's talking. So that's totally up to you. And also during this session, if you have any questions for Sheri as she's speaking this evening, you are welcome to type any questions into the chat. And the chat button is in the bottom middle of your screen there. And I will moderate or keep track of those questions and facilitate a Q&A time after Sheri is done speaking with us. So you are here to view the third session of For the Beauty of the Earth, an interactive webinar series. And the focus of this series is to explore the many, many intersections of climate and racial justice. And as I've said before, there's no way of getting to everything because there are so many ways that they're connected. And I feel like every day, as I've said before too, I just keep learning about new ways that these issues are really intertwined and inseparable, really. So we're going to get to a few key ones throughout this series. And the format for this evening will be, we'll hear from Sheri for a bit, who will share with us. And then we'll have time for question and answer, like I said. And then following that, anybody who is able to stay and would like to is welcome to stick around for a time of small group discussion in breakout rooms. And that'll be with about 4 other people in a breakout room. And we'll just have some conversation about what we've just heard from Sheri and start doing some processing on that. So before we go any further, I'd like to take a minute to ground ourselves in prayer. And I'm going to continue in the ritual that we've been doing for the past couple of weeks and read the same prayer that I've read before. So this is a prayer that has been adapted by Carol Penner. And if you'd like to close your eyes as I read this, you're welcome to do that. You can mute your video screen if you want to, if that feels most comfortable. But I just really encourage you to kind of let yourself be grounded in this and Feel whatever emotions come up for you. Just try to notice those as I read this. Creator God, hear our prayer for settlers everywhere, for people living on land stolen and traded unfairly from Indigenous peoples. You know our cruelties, our violent erasure of cultures and histories, our cavalier dismissal of treaty rights, our personal prejudices, our institutional racism, our defensive disinterest. We are part of a colonial system so insidious that those who benefit refuse to see it, even when it's in front of our faces. You are a God who names, a God who hears. You know the name of every missing and murdered Indigenous woman. You hear the cries of every child separated from their family. You know the original names of every mountain, river, and blooming flower. You hear the earth groaning as she is torn and broken, her holy balance polluted and poisoned, and yet she continues to give. Breathe into us your winds of disruption, your great spirit, an imagination that breaks cycles of domination by rearranging landscapes, upsetting tables where money is counted, and emerging in new patterns, embodying your radical love. Creator God, give us the courage to seek justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with you toward the liberation of Earth and all of her beings. Amen. Thank you all for joining me in that time of prayer. And we're going to continue again as we have in previous sessions. And I invite you, if you know the names of the Indigenous people who originally inhabited the land that you're joining, or continue to inhabit the land that you're joining this Zoom call from, to type the names of those groups of people into the chat. And if you don't know the names of those people, this is an opportunity and an invitation to do some research and learn a little bit more about the Indigenous people who were on this land before, and many of whom remain on this land and continue to face forces of erasure and destruction. So we're going to take a couple minutes just to put these names in the chat together. Thank you all. Feel free to read these over, copy some of them if you want to save them for future research. And I'm actually going to add a website in here that's a helpful starting point for anybody who's not quite sure where to start with this, that you're welcome to explore after this meeting at some point. So moving into our time together this evening, like I said, we will be hearing from Sheri Hostetler. Sheri is just a wonderful person who I've gotten to had the kind of random chance of meeting here and there over the past couple of years. And so I'm really excited to hear what she has to share with us this evening. So just a little bit about Sheri. Sheri has been the lead pastor at First Mennonite Church of San Francisco for 20 years. Prior to that, she worked as a journalist, writer, and editor. She has an MA in Feminist Liberation Theology from the Episcopal Divinity School in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and is certified in permaculture design. After working for years on LGBTQ justice in the Mennonite Church, Sheri co-founded the Dismantling the Doctrine of Discovery Coalition in 2014. The coalition seeks to activate a movement of Anabaptist people of faith to dismantle the laws and policies that have legalized the theft of land and resources from Indigenous peoples across the world. So please join me in whatever Zoom way you'd like in welcoming Sheri with us this evening.
I have to say hi to so many faces that are near and dear to me. Some of them from my home community here, but some of them from farther afield who I haven't seen for a long time. So it's really wonderful to have all of you here. So I'm going to attempt to share my screen. And can you see my screen with nothing else? Yes, great, thank you. And thanks to Jim Leakday from my home congregation who did some last minute sort of like, he sprinkled loveliness all over this presentation. So the title of my talk, as I gave it to Nicole a few days or weeks ago, was How the Past Has Shaped Our Present, Understanding the Doctrine of Discovery and Its Impact on Indigenous People and Creation. And then as I thought of that, I thought, I don't know if I like that title. It's not bad. I mean, obviously, the Doctrine of Discovery, which legitimated colonization, had a devastating impact on Indigenous peoples. But colonization and the Doctrine of Discovery has affected so many aspects of our lives, both external aspects of our lives, like laws and policies, but also internal structures, like our worldviews, how we think about our relationship to nature, etc. And it's also so directly linked, I believe, to climate change and our present crisis of ecological degradation. And I'm going to talk about some of those ways soon, that I decided that really this title should be Understanding the Doctrine of Discovery and Its Impact on Everything. Now, that's a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but it really is connected to so many things, as I think will become clear as we go through this. So the Doctrine of Discovery, this is the definition I work with. It's a theological, philosophical, and legal framework established by the Christian Church back in the 15th century that gave European governments moral and legal rights to invade and seize indigenous lands and dominate indigenous peoples. And I just want to say real quick, I forgot to say this, I did help found this coalition to dismantle this, but I am not an expert on this. It's impossible, I think, to be an expert on something as big as this. So I'm really hoping I can learn from you all tonight too. And I think some of you have knowledge and information about this that I don't. So I'm hoping we're going to learn from each other. So the Doctrine of Discovery, I just want to correct something that I think is often confusing for people when they first start hearing about this. This does not refer to just one church doctrine, and that can be confusing because of the name Doctrine of Discovery. It refers rather to a framework of laws, policies, and worldviews that have accrued over time and that constitute a paradigm of domination. Some people have suggested we call it the Doctrine of Domination instead. Nor is it something that comes from deep in the past, that is something just from the past, from a time when Christians didn't know better. Rather, it forms the deep structure of colonization that dictates to this day who can own land and the resources from the land and who can't. So, of course, the Doctrine of Discovery is not just about owning land. And Sarah Augustine, with whom I helped found this coalition along with Anita Amstutz, and Katarina Friesen was also very near the beginning of that. She has a new book coming out from Herald Press called This Land Is Not Empty. It's coming out in June. I highly recommend it. This is a quote from that book. She says, the Doctrine of Discovery is a paradigm of domination that is threaded through all of our societal institutions, not just in the United States, but around the globe. And that is because to legitimize the taking of land, the Doctrine of Discovery had to establish an ideological framework that indigenous peoples were subhuman and fundamentally inferior to Europeans. Hebrew scriptures that justified genocide by God's chosen people and other scripture interpretations from what's called the New Testament formed a religious and moral framework that then shaped every human institution in the discovered world, quote unquote, and its worldview was reinforced in every aspect of social life. It has been repeated and practiced by every generation to this day, as evidenced in everything from whom is incarcerated, to who enters a foster home, to who receives prenatal care, to the way we teach American history, to Supreme Court decisions relating to land tenure. So, almost everything. So when did this paradigm of domination begin? So the Doctrine of Discovery began with papal bulls or decrees. And one of the most infamous is Romanus Pontifex, that was issued by this person, Pope Nicholas V in 1455. This bull granted Portuguese and Spanish kings the right to invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens, which means Muslims, and pagans whatsoever, and other enemies of Christ, wheresoever placed, and to reduce their persons to perpetual slavery, and to apply and appropriate to himself, meaning the kings, and his successors, all of these people's sovereign lands, possessions, and goods. And so together, Romanus Pontifex, along with two other papal bulls, provided the initial framework, and other things that came later just layered on top of that. The initial framework that justified colonization, yes, but also justified the global slave trade, which is something I'm not sure is as well known, and also justified imperialism. And some have suggested that we should call these papal decrees a mandate for terrorism. Since Pope Nicholas V basically gave rights of control and ownership to those who got to the lands of the quote unquote New World first, the race to grab land was on. It set off a feeding frenzy of exploration, exploitation, and conquest. Here's Christopher Columbus claiming land in the Americas for the Spanish crown. And I think it's important to note that the Doctrine of Discovery was not just, as some people have said to me, a Catholic thing. It was a European Christian idea. Queen Elizabeth I was an excommunicated Catholic who, per the Doctrine of Discovery, told her explorers, and this is John Cabot pictured here, to go where no Christian prince has yet been and acquire for me sovereignty, jurisdiction, and title. In other words, to claim the quote unquote New World in the name of Christ. So over time, these royal and papal decrees that dictated that those who discovered quote unquote lands where no Christians lived, these decrees became the basis of international law, and most Western countries incorporated this international law of discovery into their national laws and policies as well. And this happened in the United States in 1823 in a court case I'll tell you about in just a second. And Sarah has this quote, again, I'm going to quote her one more time from the book. She said, "I have found that most people are amazed when they hear this. The dominant narrative in the United States explains that indigenous peoples either sold their lands in a fair bargain or else lost their lands as a result of legal war. Few people have heard of the Doctrine of Discovery, and they're surprised when they realize that these injustices are perfectly legal. Because European and Western legal systems are based upon precedent, the land rights issues that indigenous peoples face today, reflected in legal decisions made by the US Supreme Court and high courts around the globe, are based on policy set by the church before Columbus and reinforced by legal structures for 5 centuries. So land and resource theft has been perfectly legal for more than 500 years. And that is the real nub of the issue that indigenous peoples face a lot across the world. The horrors they face are perfectly legal. And that's what we have to work on, among other things. So enter William Penn into the picture. William Penn, who I believe is, well, he's standing there. This shows, I believe, a treaty with the Lenape, the native Lenape people of Pennsylvania, what's now called Pennsylvania. William Penn, I think, as we all know, he's a wealthy Englishman, but also a Quaker. And so he was religiously persecuted, and he dreamt of a place where he and other Europeans who were also religiously persecuted, like Amish and Mennonites, could come and find freedom of religion. So he was granted the historic lands of the Lenape people by the King of England, who had laid claim to the land under the Doctrine of Discovery. Now, as I said, he invited Amish and Mennonite people to come there, and my family, the family of Jacob Hostetler, was one of those people. This is an artist rendition of his homestead in Pennsylvania around the 1730s. Penn had a commitment to treating the native Lenape people justly, at least as he saw it. And so he paid them for the land, and he let them continue to use it for hunting and fishing and traversing through it, even after it had been sold. However, Penn's sons were not so committed, and they cheated the Lenape out of lands. And after that, the good relationship between Pennsylvania and the Lenape eroded. So despite what some have called the soft colonialism of William Penn, I think it's good to recognize that the entire United States is a project of settler colonialism. And Penn and the Amish and Mennonites who came here from Europe were part of that project. And I just want to mention briefly what settler colonialism is, because I think it's important to understanding this past and the present. So settler colonialism is a distinct type of colonialism that functions by replacing indigenous populations with an invasive settler society that develops a distinctive identity and sovereignty over time. So that would be different than, say, like what happened in India, where the British came and, it didn't come and replace the indigenous population of India. They came in and ruled it and governed it with governors and soldiers, but it was a different kind of colonization. An example of a settler colonial society today is Canada, the United States, South Africa, Australia, Israel. Settler colonizers come to stay. So unlike soldiers or colonial governors, they want to permanently occupy and assert sovereignty over indigenous lands. All of these settler colonial societies use very similar power structures and social narratives. So one of the most important of those is this concept of terra nullius, which is a Latin word that means empty land or sometimes unused land. So if lands were declared terra nullius by European powers, then basically settlers were justified in taking those lands and carving up these lands that they saw as unused but were indigenous held into discrete packets of private property. Now, partly indigenous lands in the United States were emptier than they would have been, since almost 90% of the indigenous population had died due to disease brought in by the early white settlers. However, terra nullius was also declared because indigenous people who remained did not practice agriculture in the way that Europeans did. And so Europeans would declare lands terra nullius because they weren't being used in conformity with European agricultural practices. And I think it's sobering to remember that in other places besides the US, Mennonites and Amish were invited in by monarchs or governments in to essentially be settler colonialists. I know this happened in parts of Russia and the Ukraine, to basically come into farm and use the land in the proper way, and by doing so displace indigenous populations. It's happening now in Mexico today, as old colony Mennonites are coming in with sort of the approval and encouragement of the Mexican government into Mayan communities to practice industrial agriculture there. So settler collectives then create or empower the state to defend these private properties from indigenous peoples or nations who are seen as very threatening. Often this happens with what are a version of a frontier police force. And in the case of my own family, the Hostetler family, that was often the Scotch-Irish settlers who weren't pacifists, but who kind of formed a kind of militia that protected my pacifist Amish ancestors. They benefited from the protection they offered, even while they were able to kind of keep their own hands ethically clean. And also, settler colonialism, you develop these racist narratives. Often for indigenous people, that is, they're considered to be savage, they're wild, they are in need of care from the civilized settler state. And this narrative dehumanization of indigenous peoples kind of runs parallel with another narrative of the brave pioneers who are held up as paragons of, virtue and adventurousness and innovation, and they're peaceful. And then they're held up as paragons of these new settler nations that are carved out of indigenous frontier spaces. And this is still happening to this day around the world. So when I thought of this, I thought of the example of the North Kill of what's called the Hostetler massacre. I'm sure some of you must be familiar with this story. I grew up with it. And it's almost like a sacred origin story among some Mennonites and Amish. So what happened was the first Amish settlement in the Americas was around this North Kill in Pennsylvania. And during the French and Indian War, the local Lenape tribes under the command of French scouts attacked the Jacob Hostetler homestead. This was in 1757. Now, according to tradition, Jacob told his sons not to defend them using guns to protect the family. And 3 members of the family ended up being killed, and 3 were taken captive, including Jacob, who eventually escaped. But the 2 sons were only released when there was a peace treaty between the Lenape tribes and the British Army. And they actually didn't want to come home, but they made them go home. So the Hostetler massacre, as it's called, is really a commonly told story, with Jacob often cited as an exemplar of the faith for his commitment to nonviolence, even under attack. And I'm not saying this wasn't commendable, but the story is usually almost never placed, when I've heard it told, within its larger historical context of settler colonialism. The story, in most of its tellings, plays into the settler colonialist narrative of indigenous people as savages and of the virtuous and peaceful Amish colonists. So moving along, we get to that court case I was telling you about, the Johnson versus McIntosh court case that happened in 1823. I'm wondering if somebody might be willing to come off mute, and Nicole, maybe it's going to have to be you, and would be willing to read this just to get another voice out there. This is from part of the ruling that Chief Justice John Marshall made in this landmark ruling. I think you're it, Nicole.
You got it. All right. On the discovery of this immense continent, the great nations of Europe were eager to appropriate themselves so much of it, eager to appropriate to themselves so much of it as they could respectively acquire. Its vast extent offered an ample field to the ambition and enterprise of all, and the character and religion of its inhabitants afforded an apology for considering them as a people over whom the superior genius of Europe might claim an ascendancy. But as they were all in pursuit of nearly the same object, it was necessary, in order to avoid conflicting settlements and consequent war with each other, to establish a principle. This principle was that discovery gave title to the government by whose subjects or by whose authority it was made, against all other European governments, which, oh, and now my captions are cutting off, which title might be consummated by possession. Do you get it?
So, a lot of words in there, but basically what the ruling stated was that by virtue of discovering the lands of America, and really by virtue of European supremacy, which he states in there, indigenous peoples have lost, and now I'm quoting from another part of the ruling, their rights to complete sovereignty as independent nations, and they retain only the right of occupancy in their lands. So according to Marshall, the US, after winning its independence in 1776, became a successor nation to the right of discovery and acquired the power of dominion from Great Britain. So as late as 2005, Ruth Bader Ginsburg cited this landmark 1823 decision in a case that came to the Supreme Court that had to do with the repurchase of tribal lands and tribal sovereignty. And she wrote in the ruling to not restore tribal sovereignty. She later said that this was the one decision she made as a judge that she regretted the most. But this is what I mean by precedent. It is still being, this ruling is still being used to not adhere to tribal sovereignty. So I'm gonna pretty quickly go through these eras of federal policy towards Indian peoples that tell the story of how the doctrine of discovery was enacted in the US and Mennonite involvement with that. I think it's going to be a kind of quick run, but I think it's important. So soon after that ruling, that Johnson v. McIntosh ruling, in 1830, the Indian Removal Act is passed by Congress during the presidency of Andrew Jackson. This act gave power to governments to make treaties with Native nations that forced them to give up their lands in exchange for land west of the Mississippi. Now, on the surface, these treaties make it sound like it's voluntary, but in reality, most of the treaties are made forcefully, either through literal force, like forced marches. This is the Trail of Tears, which I think a lot of people have heard of, but there was also the Trail of Death that probably maybe many of you have been on that pilgrimage, and there's numerous other forced marches. Also by withholding food, such as decimating the indigenous food sources such as buffalo, and then also just through outright violence, including warfare. And as these Native American lands are cleared, white settlers, including Amish and Mennonites, stream into these lands. And this is a photograph from Holmes County, Ohio, where I'm from. And my Amish ancestors were among the first white settlers to come into land in Ohio that had been basically cleared of its indigenous inhabitants through the Indian Wars. And when I realized this, I thought, like, what an incredible irony that these pacifist people basically got their lands by virtue of military violence. Then there's the reservation era. Basically, there's just increased pressure by settlers and also by railroad executives, railroads to get access to land in the West. And so the US government began to confine indigenous people to reservations. Of course, indigenous people, as they have done all along, resist this, and they engage in what the US Army calls the Indian Wars in the West for decades, but finally they're defeated by the military and by the continuing waves of settlers, and they agree to negotiate agreements to resettle on reservations. So this shows reservations and tribal jurisdictions in the United States. I don't know how many people know that a delegation from South Africa was sent to Canada and the US to observe how to develop a reservation system. And in 1913, South Africa passed the Native Lands Act after they'd been to the US and Canada, which declared 87% of South Africa national lands for whites only. And the remaining 13% was divided up into reserves based on the North American system. And then in 1948, apartheid was formalized in South Africa. And I did put these maps side by side to invite you to see the similarities between the two of them. As we know, I think even reservations didn't protect Native peoples from dispossession. In Moundridge, Kansas, this is a story that came through some of our coalition members. The Osage Nation moved to Missouri and Kansas per an 1825 treaty, but then by the late 1860s, pressure from white settlers and again from railroad executives who wanted land rights caused Congress to open up the entire reservation to white settlement. And the Osage were forced to accept the terms, and then they moved further west to Indian Territory in Oklahoma. 1 year later, in 1871, the first Swiss Mennonites began settling in that area. And then several years later, the railroad brought thousands of Dutch Prussian Mennonites from Russia to settle on lands bought from the Santa Fe Railroad through central Kansas. So it is, in a bunch of places, it turns out that Amish and Mennonite settlers were some of the first to come onto these lands. There is then, of course, the assimilation era. This is when the US government began to shift its policy to one of assimilation. They believed that the Indian way of life was communistic and backwards. The fact that they wanted to own their property collectively was seen as not civilized. And they felt like if they made Native people have private ownership of their land, that would basically cause them to become assimilated into the American settler population. And it would, and so And also in addition to that, just a lot of people believed Indigenous people had too much land, and they were eager to see these lands opened up for settlement, as well as for extractive industries like mining and forestry. So under the 1887 Allotment Act, or Dawes Act, every Indigenous man 18 years or older was allotted 160 acres of land. And after all Indigenous men are designating land as their own private property, the rest was opened up for white settlement. So land the US government allows Indigenous people to occupy was reduced by approximately 2/3 by 1934 because of the Allotment Acts. And I visited Sarah on the Yakama Indian Reservation, and there's a map that shows how the Allotment Act carved up that reservation into these parcels of land, into this checkerboard where there's not even contiguous land owned by Indigenous people that even abuts each other a lot of times. So it was basically another sophisticated land grab. And another strategy for assimilating Native peoples into white European culture was the boarding schools. The first one was founded in the 1870s by Richard Henry Pratt. He removed 84 Lakota children from their families, and his principle was to kill the Indian and save the man. That's a direct quote. And he was considered a progressive of his era. That became a model for government policy, and by 1900, there's thousands of Native children who are attending close to 155 boarding schools. The schools are attempted to strip the children of their culture and remove them from the influence of their family and nation. I think, as we know especially from the Truth and Reconciliation commissions that happened in Canada, sexual abuse and other forms of abuse are rife in these boarding schools. In 1880, the General Conference Mennonite Church established the Darlington Mennonite Mission Boarding School among the Arapaho and Cheyenne in what became known as Oklahoma. And then 3 years later, Mennonites were given a former US military barracks a few miles away in Canton, Oklahoma. And that became the Cantonment Mennonite Mission Boarding School. And that picture there on the bottom is from that school. And then there's also was another Mennonite-run boarding school in Halstead, Kansas. So the last era I'm going to mention is the termination era. This was when the federal government decided that they wanted to basically, as rapidly as possible, make Indians within the territorial limits of the United States subject to the same laws and entitled to, as they said, the same privileges and responsibilities. So they basically ended the tribal rights of a lot of sovereign nations, and also terminated, when they did that, healthcare and education programs. So about 109 tribes ended up being terminated. Approximately 2.5 million acres of their land, of their trust land, was removed from protected status. The lands were sold to non-Indigenous people. All of the tribes around where I live are not federally recognized, and it's a real problem for them, and they are seeking federal recognition. The photo here actually shows an Indian leader, George Gillette, breaking down during one of these pieces of legislation in which land was taken away and rights were terminated in, I believe, 1949. In addition to this policy of termination, the Board of Indian Affairs began a voluntary urban relocation program in which Native people were encouraged to relocate from rural areas to cities like Cleveland and Denver and Seattle and Los Angeles. But the problem was it was a real struggle for folks to adjust to life in urban areas. They were really divorced from their culture and their communities. Homelessness and discrimination and low-paying jobs were a lot of their realities. When the BIA began this urban relocation effort, nearly 8% of American Indians lived in cities, when by 2000, that number had risen to 64%. So this is a lot of history. Let's take a deep breath. And I know that was a lot to throw at you at once, probably too much, but I say that in part because I think as your prayer said, Nicole, we want to make visible what has been invisible, or sometimes what's been right in front of our eyes. This is history that lots of white people especially don't know. It's hard history, it's necessary history, but there is good news because Indigenous people around the world are resisting the doctrine of discovery and have for centuries. And there are so many ways that we can show up in solidarity with Indigenous people around the world. That's why we founded the Dismantling the Doctrine of Discovery Coalition, to educate folks about this history, to decolonize our own imaginations and worldviews, and to dismantle this structure that the Christian church created. So I want to talk about at the end here, almost at the end of my presentation, about one way that the doctrine of discovery plays out in the present, how Indigenous people are resisting it, how we can be a part of it. And then I want to make the connection with that example to climate crisis and ecological destruction. So this is the land of the San Carlos Apache, near the tribe near Tucson, Arizona. It's called Oak Flat. Back in 1914, Terry Rambler, who is the chairman of the San Carlos Apache tribe at the time, was in Washington, D.C. for a White House Tribal Nations conference. He literally woke up the morning of the conference to find out that Congress was at that moment deciding to give away a large part of his ancestral homeland to a foreign mining company. This happened in a lame duck session of Congress, who utilized the National Defense Authorization Act to give 2,400 acres of the Tonto National Forest in Arizona to basically a Australian English copper mining company. This land that was given away has been a sacred site of prayer and ceremony since time immemorial for the San Carlos Apache. It's used as a coming of age ritual site for girls. It is like, a cathedral might be for some Western Christians. And if copper mining begins there, the land is going to be decimated. Now, we all know why the San Carlos Apache don't own their land. The U.S. Forest Service owns it instead. The San Carlos Apache have been asking folks to stand in solidarity with them ever since 2014 through prayer and advocacy, and it's working. The land has not yet been turned over to the copper mining company. There's a lawsuit pending. I won't say it's hopeful, but it hasn't been turned over yet. So how does this all relate to, climate crisis? The proposed mine, this copper mine, would use 3.8 trillion gallons of water from the Colorado River, a river that is already pretty tapped out already. It would take I think I'm getting this right. Is that trillion or is it another? Anyways, whatever. It's a really big number. 2.1, I think, trillion kilowatt hours produced mostly by burning carbon just to bring the water to the site. That doesn't include the energy to run the mine. If Oak Flat were to be destroyed, a native year-round source of flowing water and aquifer water would also be destroyed. So the little bit of water that is in Arizona would be destroyed there. The loss of carbon sink of ancient oaks and other vegetation would increase the speed of rising heat in an already very hot region. It would cause, they would have to use more water, as Carol Rose said, stolen from Mexico. And then I got all of these facts from Carol Rose, who's pastor at Shalom Mennonite in Tucson and very involved with the San Carlos Apache. As she said, we're not going to get out of this climate crisis using the same thinking and mechanisms that got us into it. We need to learn from and follow the leadership of Indigenous people and others who are first and most affected. Through long resistance to the colonial structures that target them, the Apache have learned how to undermine those structures in spirit and in action. And in this situation that threatens Oak Flat, we have an opportunity to join with the Apache and walk beside them and learn from them. So San Carlos, that is but one example of really hundreds of how the doctrine of discovery operates today. Around the world, the doctrine of discovery legitimates resource extraction from ancestral indigenous lands. So mining, fracking, logging, plantation agriculture. For those of you from my church, that's taken from Indonesia. It's the Kalimantan National Forest, where a doctor in our church founded a health clinic. And oil pipelines that go through indigenous lands. This is from line 3, which indigenous people are fighting up in Minnesota and asking for us to participate in and seeking to stop that pipeline. These extractive industries take resources from indigenous communities to benefit those descended from European colonial or post-colonial nations. In addition, these extractive industries often pollute the lands, water, and bodies of indigenous peoples on indigenous homelands without penalty or censure. So for instance, in gold mining, which you can see there in the bottom left corner, just sort of to the above the fracking, that's actually a gold mine from in Suriname where Sarah Augustine has worked. That gold mining releases mercury into the waterways. These are waterways that the traditional people there rely on for their main protein source of fish and also for water. And they did testing to test mercury in the bodies of some of the Wayana people who live along these waterways, and all of them tested positive for high levels of mercury. So in closing, I wanted to say why us and why now? Why is this so urgent now? The climate crisis is connected to the doctrine of discovery. Sometimes I think people tend to see those things as separate. I know I first started wanting to get involved in working on the climate crisis in the Anabaptist Church, and I pretty quickly found the work connected to the doctrine of discovery because they, I believe, are so intimately connected. Resource extraction, like mining and industrial agriculture and et cetera, is ecological degradation. And we are consuming the earth with resource extraction, and we simply can't keep doing it. We are reaching the actually biophysical limits of our planet. Those who benefit from the doctrine of discovery and settler colonialism have a special responsibility to work on it. I know I've benefited from it, the security and stability that my family has enjoyed ever since they set foot in this country in 1732, because they were able to own good farmland, has formed a foundation of my life that it would be very easy for me to take for granted until I see those who didn't have that foundation. But if you have a retirement account or other investments, you may also be benefiting from resource extraction in the doctrine of discovery, because resources extracted from indigenous communities flow back to many of us through corporate profits, which benefit our own mutual funds and investments. Many of us are invested in oil and gas companies and mining companies. I have a retirement account through Everence, and Everence is invested in Newmont Mining. Now, that's a complicated question about whether they should stay invested, but there's some ideas about how we can, about that I could share with you if you're interested in it later. And then a few of our institutions, whether economic or governmental, have the will to dismantle this doctrine since they profit too much from it. So the church is the one institution left that can speak out clearly against this unjust system, as it has done in the past against slavery and apartheid. Because the doctrine of discovery is based on principles that originated with the church has a special responsibility to dismantle this unjust structure. And this is starting to happen in many different denominations. And this is the crew that's doing it with me within the Mennonite church. This is people from the Dismantling the Doctrine of Discovery Coalition. We're a fun group of people. We enjoy each other. If you'd like to join us, there's our website address. So thank you. I appreciate you listening to that long bit of what to me felt like a long presentation. And I'm happy to hear any questions or comments you might have.
Thank you so much, Sheri. Let's give Sheri our Zoom version of round of applause, or you can put a reaction there. Really appreciate what you shared with us, and Feeling pretty fired up. Yeah. Yeah, just thank you for sharing a history that I, for one, was not taught in school, and I'm guessing many of us weren't taught in school. So thank you for bringing that this evening. So yeah, we're gonna now open it up to a time of Q&A. You are welcome to type your questions into the chat, like I said, or feel free to unmute and ask it just verbally. So this is an open space. Anybody's welcome to ask any questions they might have.
Anita here. Hi, Sheri.
Hi.
That was excellent. And thank you for putting that together. I need to jump off to another Zoom meeting, but I wanted to just note, Sheri's talking about this in kind of like a huge systemic way. I've been reading a book by Resmaa Menakem, who has done My Grandmother's Hands, which is really deeply impacting me because she talks, he is a therapist and works with trauma patients, and he basically says we're not going to transform our society until we as white bodies begin to transform the trauma that came with us from the European continent. She said centuries of white Europeans have been traumatizing people, our own white-skinned people and other people on the European continent, and we brought that to this country and enacted this extermination project. And so anyway, it's just amazing to talk about, for me, to think about the Mennonite story of martyrdom, because he says trauma is about, you use a tremendous amount of energy to survive now in this moment. And when we think about what we do to try to make our lives comfortable or to survive or to ensure that our tribe, our families are comfortable, what would it mean to face why we have to do that, and how that ensures traumatizing another body group of people or the earth in order to make sure we have what our tribe, needs and wants. So I wanted to throw that out, and thank you so much for this presentation.
Yeah, it would be so easy to do a whole other presentation on sort of just that inner work of looking at the trauma of that so many Europeans brought to this land, and then, as Resmaa Menakem says, blew through Black and brown bodies.
Other questions or comments?
I'm curious, I don't know how any of you can respond to this, but I'm curious, if I was doing a Zoom poll, I would say, how much of this was new information for you? It's hard to know how much of it is, how much of this sort of history has already gotten out there, but so, I know what I'll do. For those of you who are on camera, how many of you for whom this was like, if it was almost all new information, what if you were like that? Maybe like, no, it was not new information, maybe somewhere in the middle. Could I just see okay. Yeah. Well, sorry for those of you for whom this wasn't new information.
Since white people don't tend to get taught this in school, or not from this viewpoint, do the Indigenous people know this? Or do they just have this trauma that's part of them without knowing their whole history?
Well, I can only tell you what I've heard from Sarah, with whom and Sarah has said that, she, and I've heard one or two other Native people say this, that they also had to discover the doctrine of discovery. As Sarah says in the book that's coming out, I just thought my family was messed up. And I didn't realize that she said I just thought I was the product of dysfunctional parents who made bad decisions. I didn't realize that what happened to my family was planned. And that is pretty And that, it was planned by the it was planned by the US government. And she goes through in one part of the book, like the different policy areas and basically how that impacted her family.
I'm just thinking myself in the field of Mennonite history, how we need to be rethinking the vocabulary we use. So, for example, when we talk about migration, should we be talking about invasion, or just what literally what terminology has the most that takes this into account?
Yeah, that's a great question, Jim. I also think I don't know enough about settler colonization, but I think it's interesting to look at like who gets used as in that project. I mean, in this sense, it was people fleeing persecution who became then pretty willing settler colonizers because they were fleeing persecution, but also because they had absorbed, a theology that I guess, I don't know, I guess made it seem acceptable. But I think you've raised a really good question, Jim.
Hey, Sheri, Carl Shelley here. Thanks so much. I think toward the end, you mentioned that there's all kinds of these resistance efforts going on. There's a few, of course, that are better known than others, like Oak Flat and Standing Rock.
Yeah.
Is there a good source you point to for folks to find out? Like you mentioned, there's stuff going on in Minnesota and other things.
Yeah. Well, if you're not signed up for the coalition's emails, I would say do that, because we have two campaigns going, and one is working with the San Carlos Apache, and one is actually working with Mayan folks who are dealing with the encroachment of old colony Mennonite communities into their lands. But more than that, we're looking at other things too. I would also say, Winona LaDuke's website, I think it's called Honor the Earth, I found that to be a place that often is kind of like a good clearinghouse. I think it's just called, I'm putting her name in the chat. And then also, there's a publication called Indian Country Today that I subscribe to. That's not going to list all of these things, but it's going to list some of them.
Sheri, I was just going to add too, if you think of other resources and you want to send them my way, all of these people, I have their emails, so I can, in the follow-up email to this event, I can include some of those as well. So if you have things that come to mind, I can send those out.
Yeah, I also know that, in local areas, there are often, we haven't gotten super involved as a congregation into some of the local activism that's happening, although we have had Ohlone men come and speak at our church who have said that they would love to have our help, like when they do these regular campaigns to try to encourage Dianne Feinstein to federally recognize them as a tribe. So that would be a way that I think we could, get involved with some of the things that local tribes are trying to do to work on dismantling the doctrine of discovery. But that takes obviously some time and some contacts and relationship building to get to that place. Line 3, if you go to that Honor the Earth website, there's a lot of information on Line 3, which is sort of the next Standing Rock. Jim, I know Jim Lichty, I guess most of our information has come through East Point Peace Academy. I didn't know if you were aware of any sort of national websites that talked about Line 3 and the resistance there.
There is a very specific line, and I think if you type in Line 3 and did a search for Line 3 and Enbridge, that's the corporation building the line, you would easily come up with the main, it might even be just line3.org or something like that. I don't remember it offhand. Let's see.
So for the sake of time here, we're going to take one more question, but never fear, there's more opportunity to talk about these things if you stick around for the breakout groups. So we'll take one more question at the moment. I see Kenneth, your hand is raised. If you'd like to go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, Sheri. Hey, can you describe some of the upcoming resources that are being developed by the coalition?
Oh, yeah, right, of course. Well, in addition to Sarah's book that's coming out in June, There's also a podcast that Sarah and I are doing that's being hosted by Anabaptist World that also will come out around June. It's mostly Sarah talking, not me, so it's even better. And then we also have a resource coming out on land acknowledgement and reparations that I'm not actually sure when we're hoping to have that come out, but that will be on our website. It will be posted there as a free resource. And I've already read that. It's really good. It's for congregations that haven't already done land acknowledgement. It allows you to take that step, but then when you're ready to take the next step to look at what reparations could look like, it talks about what that could look like.
All right, well, thank you so much, everybody, for your wonderful questions and for Sheri taking some more time here. Before people start hopping off, if they're not planning to join for the breakout room small discussion, I just want to give a quick plug for next week's session, which will be the final session before we take a bit of a break. Next week, I'm switching things up on you here. It's going to be on Monday evening at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. And we are going to be hearing from Vonetta Storbakken, who is the co-founder and executive director of Radical Living, and also the co-founder of the Brooklyn Peace Center. And she has titled her session with us, Transforming Communities Through Urban Farming.